Hey guys, tonight we begin with a sound. Not a trumpet or a war cry, just a pebble dropping into the mud outside your tent at 3 in the morning. Maybe it was a rat, maybe it was wind, maybe it was an enemy scout testing whether anyone's actually awake. You have exactly 2 seconds to decide whether to sound the alarm that wakes 5,000 armed men and possibly starts a battle, or to stay silent and hope you're right. Get it wrong either way, and you're dead. Possibly by enemy blade, more likely by your own commander's fury at false alarms, or your comrades' rage at your negligence that got them killed. This was the reality of siege warfare for every soldier manning the night watch. Not the glorious cavalry charges they paint on tapestries, but hours of darkness where every shadow moves, every sound means death. And the worst part is that 99% of the time, it's nothing. Your brain knows this. Your body disagrees. It screams that something's out there, that the enemy is creeping closer, that you're about to die. And once or twice a week, your body is right, which means you can never ignore it. Welcome to the psychological torture chamber known as the medieval siege line. What's fascinating isn't that siege warfare was brutal. Everyone knows that. What's fascinating is how these armies maintained any kind of function at all when subjected to weeks or months of sustained terror, boredom, disease, and paranoia. The quiet rules that emerged weren't written in military manuals. They were discovered through trial, error, and mass death. Every procedure existed because someone had once not followed it, and everyone nearby died screaming. The password system, the watch rotation, the punishment for sleeping on duty, these weren't bureaucracy. They were scar tissue from catastrophic failures. And here's the modern connection. We're living in a society that demands similar, sustained vigilance. Security personnel watching monitors for threats that probably won't come. Parents monitoring baby monitors for sounds that might mean danger. Workers on call 24/7 waiting for the notification that requires immediate response. The technology changed. The psychological toll didn't. We've built an entire civilization on the expectation that someone is always watching, always ready, always one mistake away from disaster. Tonight, we're exploring how medieval armies managed the impossible task of keeping thousands of men alert through darkness without descending into paranoid chaos. How the system worked when it did, and catastrophically failed when it didn't. And what this reveals about the human capacity for sustained vigilance under stress. Get comfortable. This is going to be a long night. If this exploration of historical, psychological warfare sounds intriguing, take a moment to subscribe to Candle History before we continue. I create these deep investigations because I believe you can handle complexity and discomfort in equal measure. Let me know in the comments what time zone you're in and whether you're watching this during a night shift yourself. The irony of learning about medieval watch duty while pulling modern watch duty appeals to me. Now, let's examine exactly why you'd probably cause a panic on your first night manning a siege line. The medieval siege line was less a battle formation and more a temporary city built around the prospect of violence. When an army settled in to starve out a castle or fortified town, they weren't just soldiers waiting to fight. They became a population of thousands living in improvised camps, maintaining supply lines, managing sanitation, and somehow staying combat ready through weeks or months of waiting. The siege of Acre during the Third Crusade lasted nearly 2 years. 2 years of men living in tents, eating whatever supplies could reach them, and dying more often from disease than arrows. The camp layout followed patterns that would become standardized over centuries of trial and error. The commander's tent occupied the center, surrounded by guards and the most elite troops. Regular soldiers spread outward in rough formations based on their units, creating neighborhoods of canvas and mud. Between these encampments ran crude streets, pathways worn by constant traffic. At the perimeter, the watchtowers and guard posts formed the critical defensive ring. This wasn't decorative. The besieged castle was desperate. Sorties, sudden attacks from the defenders could happen at any moment, day or night. The men manning these siege lines weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense. Many were levied farmers serving their required military service. Others were mercenaries fighting for pay. Some were minor nobles leading their household troops. This created a strange mix of motivations and skill levels. The knight who'd trained since childhood fought alongside the peasant who'd held a spear for the first time 3 weeks ago. The experienced mercenary who'd survived 5 sieges shared a tent with the merchant's son playing soldier for glory. Managing this mixed force required systems that accounted for both expertise and incompetence. Disease was the primary killer. Dysentery, typhoid, plague, these thrived in camps where thousands of men defecated in the same general area, drew water from contaminated sources, and lived in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. The smell was legendary. Armies could be detected from miles away by the stench. Latrine pits, improperly managed, became vectors for illness. Food spoilage was constant. Vermin were everywhere. The Black Death killed more crusaders than Saracens ever did. A siege camp was basically a biological warfare experiment conducted on its own occupants. Boredom alternated with terror in ways that destroyed morale. Days would pass with nothing happening. Men gambled, fought over scraps, drank when they could find alcohol, and generally drove each other insane through proximity. Then suddenly the alarm would sound, enemy sortie. Everyone scrambled for weapons and positions, adrenaline spiking, ready to fight and die. And frequently it was a false alarm. Maybe it was scouts, maybe it was a small probing attack, maybe someone saw shadows and panicked. The constant up and down between crushing boredom and mortal terror created psychological conditions that modern psychiatry would recognize as trauma-inducing. Supply lines determine survival. An army besieging a castle had to maintain its own supply while cutting off the enemy's. This created a race of attrition. Could the besiegers starve the defenders before their own supplies ran out, or disease killed them all? Wagon trains arrived irregularly, bringing food, arrows, replacement equipment. When they didn't arrive, for whatever reason, the army began to starve. Commanders had to ration carefully, balancing the need to keep soldiers fed against the unknown duration of the siege. Too generous, and they'd run out. Too stingy, and the men would mutiny or desert. The weather made everything worse. Summer sieges meant heat, dehydration, and festering wounds. Winter sieges meant hypothermia, frostbite, and the impossibility of maintaining watch through nights so cold that men literally froze to death at their posts. Rain turned camps into swamps. Snow buried tents. Storms scattered supplies. And through it all, the watch had to continue. Someone always had to be alert, scanning the darkness, ready to sound the alarm that might save or doom the army. The night watch was where siege warfare revealed its true horror. Daytime was manageable. You could see threats. You had activities to occupy attention. But night transformed the siege line into a nightmare landscape where any sound might presage death. The systems that evolved to manage this weren't gentle. They couldn't afford to be. The cost of negligence was measured in massacre. Watch duty operated in rotations that varied by army but followed similar logic. No man could maintain alertness for more than a few hours. Fatigue led to mistakes. Mistakes led to death. So watches were typically 4 to 6 hours split across the night. First watch covered sunset to midnight. Second watch took midnight to dawn. These were further subdivided so that guards changed every 2 hours, creating constant rotation that kept fresh eyes on the perimeter. In theory. In practice, exhausted men struggled to stay awake through any rotation. The watchers themselves occupied an uncomfortable space between trust and suspicion. They had to be reliable enough to detect threats, but not so high-ranking that their presence on watch duty deprived the army of leadership. This meant the watch fell primarily to common soldiers, the men most likely to be exhausted, least experienced, and most prone to errors. The system compensated through redundancy. Multiple guards watched the same sector from different positions. They were ordered to check in with each other regularly through agreed-upon signals. A missed signal meant investigation. Passwords saved lives and cost them in equal measure. Every night brought a new password that changed at irregular intervals to prevent enemies from learning it. Guards challenged anyone approaching with a demand for the password. Failure to respond correctly meant death. Simple enough, except exhausted men forget things. Soldiers returning from latrine visits or scouts reporting back had to remember the current password while possibly injured, definitely terrified, and sometimes drunk. Stories abound of men killed by their own side because they blanked on the password while stumbling back to camp in darkness. The challenge response system added complexity. Instead of just a single password, guards would issue a challenge phrase and expect a specific response. This reduced the risk of enemies overhearing passwords and using them. During the siege of Constantinople in 1453, guards used Greek phrases that Turks couldn't properly pronounce. The Byzantines could identify infiltrators by accent, even if they knew the words. But this assumed guards were educated enough to detect pronunciation subtleties while exhausted and terrified, which was optimistic. Sound discipline became obsessive. Coffin guards were reassigned away from the perimeter because coffs carried. Armor was wrapped in cloth to prevent clanking. Weapons were kept sheathed until absolutely necessary. Fires were banned near watchposts because they ruined night vision and advertised positions. Conversations were forbidden. The ideal guard was invisible, inaudible, and utterly alert. The reality was men trying not to sneeze while scanning darkness and hoping desperately that nothing happened on their watch. The watchtowers and posts themselves varied based on resources and terrain. Wooden platforms elevated guards above the camp, providing sight lines, but also making them targets. Stone fortifications were built when siege lines became permanent, transforming the camp into a counter-fortress. Guards stationed in these positions had to maintain vigilance while knowing they were the first targets in any attack. If the enemy broke through, the watchers died first. This knowledge didn't exactly encourage relaxation. Signal systems allowed watchers to communicate across the line without shouting. Bells, horns, specific drum patterns, these all conveyed different meanings. One bell might mean routine check-in. 3 bells meant alarm. But systems failed. Guards missed signals in the noise of camp life. Signals were misinterpreted. And sometimes guards gave false alarms, sounding the bell because they saw something that turned out to be nothing, rousing the entire army from sleep for no reason. The punishment for this was severe enough to make guards hesitate, which meant they sometimes delayed too long, and real threats went unannounced. The punishment for failing at watch duty was death. Not usually, always. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was cold calculation. An army where guards could sleep, where discipline could slip, When negligence went unpunished, that army died. Everyone understood this. The rules were simple and absolute. Sleep on watch equals execution. Miss a signal equals execution. Fail to challenge someone equals execution. The system ran on fear because trust got everyone killed. Medieval military justice was performative and immediate. When a guard was found sleeping, the trial, if you could call it that, happened within hours. The commander would assemble troops to witness the punishment. The guilty guard would be brought forward. Judgment would be pronounced. Then death, usually by hanging or beheading, carried out while the army watched. This served multiple purposes. It punished the individual, deterred others, and demonstrated that command authority was absolute. No exceptions, no mercy. The methods of execution varied by culture and circumstance. Roman legions would beat to death with clubs any legionary found sleeping on watch. The beating was carried out by the soldiers' own tent mates, forcing complicity and ensuring everyone understood the stakes. Medieval Europeans favored hanging or beheading, quick deaths that nonetheless made the point. Byzantine armies sometimes used exposure, tying negligent guards to stakes outside the camp perimeter and leaving them for enemies to find. Death by arrow, by blade, by exposure, the method mattered less than the certainty. False alarms occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. Commanders needed guards alert enough to sound alarms at suspicious activity. But false alarms exhausted troops and bred cynicism. The boy who cried wolf was a military parable before it was a children's story. So punishments for false alarms had to be severe enough to prevent panic, but lenient enough that guards still erred toward caution. This usually meant public humiliation, reduced rations, demotion, or flogging. Enough to sting, not enough to kill. The calculus was delicate. The Varangian Guard of Byzantium exemplified perfect discipline through brutal enforcement. These Norse and Anglo-Saxon warriors serving Byzantine emperors were legendary for their watch discipline. A Varangian caught sleeping on guard duty faced execution without trial or appeal. Their reputation for incorruptible vigilance came from absolute punishment of any deviation. Emperors could sleep soundly, knowing their guards preferred death in battle to dishonor through negligence. This level of discipline required constant reinforcement through example. Regular executions of guards who failed, even slightly, maintained the standard. Collective punishment kept units honest. If one man in a watch team failed, the entire team faced consequences. This created peer pressure stronger than any commander's authority. Soldiers watched each other, keeping everyone alert through mutual surveillance. The man next to you wasn't just a fellow soldier. He was your judge, your enforcer, your guarantee against negligence. If he slept, you all died. If you slept, they killed you to prevent command from killing everyone. The system made soldiers police themselves more harshly than officers ever could. Bribery and corruption ate away at these systems from within. Wealthy soldiers could sometimes pay others to take their watch duty. Officers could be convinced to overlook minor infractions for the right price. This worked until it didn't. One bribed guard sleeping through an attack could cost hundreds of lives. So commanders who discovered corruption made examples that were even more brutal than standard punishments. The guard who took a bribe faced execution. The officer who accepted the bribe faced execution. And sometimes their entire units faced decimation, the ancient practice of killing every 10th man to restore discipline through terror. You've been with me through several thousand words of medieval security systems, and you're still here, which means you appreciate this kind of detailed historical investigation. Candle history explores exactly these patterns, the invisible systems that shaped civilization through fear and necessity. The subscribe button is there when you want more. Now let's examine what actually went wrong when watch systems failed. The night of September 29, 1364, at the siege of Ari in Brittany, demonstrates exactly how catastrophically watch failure could cascade. The English forces besieging the castle had maintained their watch rotations for 6 weeks. Exhaustion was total. Morale was crumbling. Then a guard in the eastern sector fell asleep. Just one man. 40 minutes of unconsciousness. In that window, French soldiers from the castle launched a sortie, sneaking past the sleeping guard and infiltrating the English camp. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the French were already among the tents, setting fires and killing sleeping soldiers. The alarm sounded too late. Guards who heard it assumed it was another false alarm. They'd had 3 in the previous week. Critical minutes were lost to hesitation and confusion. When commanders finally got soldiers organized, the French sortie force was already withdrawing with prisoners and supplies. The casualty count was devastating. 73 English soldiers dead, another 40 captured. The siege was abandoned within a week. One sleeping guard had broken an entire siege operation and cost dozens of lives. The psychological aftermath was worse than the physical damage. The remaining guards became paranoid. Every sound triggered alarm responses. False alarms multiplied as exhausted, terrified men saw threats in every shadow. The army descended into a state of hypervigilance that was itself destructive. Soldiers couldn't sleep, even off watch, because the constant alarms kept jolting them awake. Within days, men were hallucinating from sleep deprivation. The siege line, already a nightmare, became genuinely unmanageable. Discipline dissolved. Desertions multiplied. The English commander had no choice but to withdraw. Similar failures repeated throughout siege history. At the siege of Nicaea in 1097, during the First Crusade, Crusader sentries reported seeing Turkish reinforcements approaching in darkness. The alarm was sounded. 10,000 men scrambled to defensive positions. Hours passed. Nothing happened. At dawn, scouts discovered that the sentries had mistaken a dust storm for an approaching army. The Crusaders had wasted an entire night's sleep and exhausted their alertness for phantom enemies. But commanders couldn't punish the guards because they'd followed protocol. Better a false alarm than missing a real threat. The incident created exactly the cynicism commanders feared. The siege of Osaka Castle in 1615 showed what happened when watch systems worked perfectly but were overwhelmed anyway. The Tokugawa forces maintained elaborate watch rotations around the castle. Their discipline was exemplary. Guards were alert, protocols were followed, signals were clear. Yet the Toyotomi defenders inside the castle launched night sorties of such ferocity that the Tokugawa watch systems couldn't contain them. Guards sounded alarms, troops responded instantly. But the defenders had planned for this, using the alarm itself to create chaos. They'd attack in waves, triggering alarms in multiple sectors simultaneously, spreading defensive forces too thin. This revealed the fundamental limitation of watch systems. They could detect threats and sound alarms, but they couldn't prevent determined attacks. The psychological terror of night watch came partly from this knowledge. You could do everything right and still die. Perfect vigilance was no guarantee of survival. This created a learned helplessness that ate at morale. Guards became fatalistic, knowing their alertness might be irrelevant against overwhelming force. Disease spread faster through exhausted watch rotations. Soldiers deprived of proper sleep suffered immune system collapse. The dysentery that was already endemic in siege camps became epidemic when guards couldn't rest. At the siege of Constantinople in 1204, Crusader commanders noticed a pattern. Men who'd recently completed night watch died of disease at rates 3 times higher than those who hadn't. The stress of vigilance literally killed them. But reducing watch rotations meant spreading exhaustion across more men, killing everyone slower instead of some men faster. Weather created failures no discipline could prevent. During the siege of Harlech Castle in 1468, a snowstorm hit the English siege lines at midnight. Visibility dropped to 0. Guards couldn't see beyond arm's length. Sound became unreliable as wind drowned everything. The defenders inside the castle heard the storm and recognized the opportunity. They launched a sortie in conditions where the English watch system was effectively blind. The guards never had a chance. They couldn't see the attack coming. They couldn't sound coherent alarms through the wind. By the time the storm cleared at dawn, the sortie had already succeeded, capturing supplies and prisoners while the English blundered through blizzard conditions. The human mind isn't designed for sustained vigilance. This isn't a moral failing, it's biology. Our attention systems evolved for environments where threats came irregularly, where most of the time nothing happened, where relaxation was safe. Siege warfare inverted this. It demanded constant alertness through conditions where relaxing for even minutes could mean death. The psychological costs were catastrophic, predictable, and unavoidable. Hypervigilance became the baseline state. Guards scanning darkness for threats couldn't simply stop when their watch ended. Their nervous systems remained activated, adrenaline elevated, ready for dangers that might or might not come. This state is exhausting. The body wasn't meant to maintain it for hours, much less weeks. Sleep became impossible even when permitted. Guards would lie in their tents, hearing every sound, interpreting it as threat, unable to relax enough for actual rest. They'd return to their next watch rotation already exhausted from not sleeping. Hallucinations were common and expected. After enough hours of staring into darkness, the brain starts inventing patterns. Guards reported seeing armies advancing when only wind moved grass. They heard footsteps that were rain. They smelled smoke from fires that didn't exist. Medieval commanders understood this well enough to implement verification procedures. A guard who saw something had to report it to the watch commander, who would investigate. This added layer prevented immediate alarms from hallucinations, but created delays that could prove fatal if the threat was real. Paranoia infected entire units. When one guard reported suspicious activity, everyone else became hyper-alert, seeing confirmation of threats everywhere. Confirmation bias set in. Once primed to expect attack, guards interpreted ambiguous information as supporting that expectation. A dog barking became enemy scouts. Clouds crossing the moon became movement on the ground. This feedback loop escalated quickly. Within hours, an entire watch rotation could be convinced attack was imminent based on nothing but collective anxiety. The isolation of watch duty amplified every fear. Guards stood alone or in pairs, separated from the main camp, surrounded by darkness. Every sound was amplified by solitude. The rustling that was probably an animal might be an assassin. The distant voice that was probably another guard might be enemy infiltrators. Without the social regulation that comes from being surrounded by others, guards' imaginations ran wild. They told themselves stories about what might be lurking in darkness. These stories became self-reinforcing, each watch making the next more terrifying. Sleep deprivation created cascading failures across cognitive function. Attention span collapsed. Decision-making deteriorated. Memory became unreliable. Guards couldn't remember passwords. They forgot which sector they were supposed to watch. They misinterpreted signals from other guards. All of this while being punished brutally for errors. The stress of knowing that any mistake meant execution compounded the stress of exhaustion, creating psychological conditions that guaranteed mistakes would happen. Some guards broke completely. They'd stand at their post and simply disconnect mentally, falling into dissociative states where they were physically present but cognitively absent. This was almost worse than sleeping because they appeared alert. They stood upright, eyes open, seemingly watching, but they weren't processing what they saw. Threats could approach and they wouldn't register. Other guards learned to recognize this state and would try to snap their comrades out of it, knowing that if officers discovered it, execution followed. The few soldiers who could maintain extended vigilance without breakdown became invaluable and often resented. These men had either natural resilience or had developed coping mechanisms that worked. They became permanent watch fixtures, assigned to critical posts because commanders knew they could be trusted. But their reliability made life worse for everyone else. They represented the standard everyone else failed to meet. And their presence on good watches meant everyone else got assigned to worse positions, creating resentment that fractured unit cohesion. The Siege of Acre from 1189 to 1191 killed more crusaders through disease than combat by a factor of 10 to 1. Estimates suggest 60,000 Christian soldiers died during that siege. Maybe 6,000 died in battle. The rest succumbed to dysentery, typhoid, scurvy, plague, and infections from untreated wounds. The camp became a charnel house, rows of tents filled with dying men, the smell of rot and excrement overwhelming everything. Guards pulled watch duty while stepping over corpses. The psychological impact was incalculable. Medieval medicine had no concept of germ theory. Diseases were attributed to miasma, bad air rising from swamps and corpses. This wasn't entirely wrong. Smell often correlated with disease sources, but the treatment protocols were useless. Physicians burned herbs to purify air. They bled patients to balance humors. They prayed. None of it worked. Soldiers watched their friends die from invisible enemies that medicine couldn't fight, creating a helplessness that gnawed at morale more effectively than any battlefield defeat. Sanitation in siege camps was catastrophic by design. When thousands of men occupied a fixed position for weeks or months, waste accumulated faster than it could be managed. Latrine pits were dug at the camp perimeter, downwind when possible, but wind changed direction. Pits filled and overflowed, and the same pits that collected human waste were often uncomfortably close to water sources. Wells were dug wherever water could be found, frequently downstream from latrine areas. The result was predictable. Contaminated water led to dysentery, which killed through dehydration and weakness. The chain of infection followed clear patterns that medieval armies couldn't interrupt. Sick soldiers defecated in latrine pits. Flies bred in the waste. Those flies landed on food. Other soldiers ate contaminated food and became sick. They defecated in the same pits. The cycle accelerated. Within weeks, entire camps could be overwhelmed by epidemics that spread through pathways no one understood. Commanders knew that cramped conditions bred illness, but couldn't space camps out without losing defensive cohesion. Vermin carried disease and madness in equal measure. Rats, lice, fleas, these weren't just unpleasant. They were vectors for plague, typhus, and other killers. Soldiers woke to find rats gnawing on their boots. Lice infested clothing and couldn't be eliminated. Fleas spread through camps with ruthless efficiency. Scratching led to infections. Infections led to fevers. Fevers led to death. And the whole time, men had to maintain combat readiness, stand and watch, drill in formations, preparing for battles that might come at any moment. Starvation worked slower than disease, but no less effectively. Supply disruptions were common. Bad weather delayed wagon trains. Enemy raids captured supplies. Corruption siphoned food meant for soldiers. When rations dropped, men weakened. Weakened men got sick more easily and recovered slower, if at all. They also became desperate. Food theft spread through camps. Soldiers stole from each other, from supply tents, from the dead. Officers had to guard food supplies as carefully as they guarded against enemy attacks. The smell of siege camps became legendary. Unwashed bodies, latrine overflow, rotten food, diseased flesh. These combined into a stench that could be detected miles away. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was demoralizing. It reminded everyone constantly that they were living in filth, dying slowly, for goals that often seemed abstract. The castle being besieged was right there, visible, tantalizingly close. Yet they couldn't take it. So they sat in their own filth, breathing the stench of decay, waiting to die of disease or battle, whichever came first. Wounded soldiers faced particularly grim prospects. Medieval battlefield medicine was better than nothing, but not by much. Wounds were cleaned with wine if it was available. They were bandaged with cloth that was usually dirty. Then the soldier was left to either heal or die. Infection was almost universal. Gangrene turned minor wounds fatal. Amputation was the treatment for serious injuries, performed without anesthesia beyond alcohol. Soldiers who survived amputation faced recovery in camps where cleanliness was impossible. Most died anyway. The watch duty continued regardless. Wounded men still pulled rotations if they could stand. The siege became a race of logistics. Could the besiegers maintain their supply lines long enough to starve the defenders before their own supplies failed or disease killed them all? This calculation determined siege strategy more than tactics or bravery. Commanders counted sacks of grain and calculated consumption rates against unknown siege duration. The math was brutal and imprecise. Overestimate duration and ration too severely, leading to mutiny. Underestimate and run out of food, leading to collapse. Wagon trains bringing supplies were vulnerable targets. Enemy forces would attack them, cutting siege lines off from reinforcement. During the siege of Antioch in 1098, Turkish forces repeatedly intercepted Crusader supply columns, capturing food meant for the besiegers. The Crusaders, already suffering from disease and exhaustion, began to starve. Morale collapsed. Desertions multiplied. Some soldiers resorted to eating their horses, then leather, then reportedly the dead. Whether that last part was true or propaganda is debated, but the fact that it was plausible says everything about siege conditions. The defenders inside the castle weren't passive. They launched raids specifically targeting supply depots. A successful raid could capture food and weapons while destroying what they couldn't carry. This forced besiegers to allocate substantial forces to supply protection, weakening the siege line itself. The defenders knew this and timed raids to exploit weakness. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers already hungry, watching limited supplies disappear to enemy raids, lost faith in the siege's success. Foraging became increasingly desperate as sieges extended. Armies stripped the surrounding countryside of anything edible. Farms were plundered, livestock was seized. Crops were harvested before maturity. This created famine in the region surrounding the siege, which meant future supplies became even harder to source. Some sieges depopulated entire regions. The civilians caught in these zones faced impossible choices: support the besiegers and risk retribution from the castle, support the defenders and risk immediate death from foragers, hide and starve. Water logistics were often overlooked by armies until they became critical. Thousands of men required substantial daily water. Sources became contaminated quickly. Wells were poisoned, sometimes deliberately by defenders, sometimes accidentally by the besiegers' own poor sanitation. Finding clean water became an obsessive concern. Guards were stationed at water sources. Soldiers fought over access. The irony of men dying of thirst while sitting in mud from recent rain wasn't lost on anyone. Winter sieges faced unique supply challenges. Food preserved differently. Fires required more fuel. Soldiers needed warmer clothing. All of this increased supply demand exactly when roads became less passable. Snow closed mountain passes. Mud made trails impassable for wagons. Rivers froze, preventing water transport. Many sieges were abandoned in winter, not because of combat failure, but because maintaining supply through bad weather proved impossible. The calculus shifted. Better to withdraw and regroup than watch your army die of exposure. Corruption ate supplies from within. Officers skimmed food meant for common soldiers, selling it for personal profit. Supply sergeants reported full inventories while warehouses sat half empty. Merchants contracted to provide supplies delivered short measures or spoiled goods. All of this happened while soldiers starved. The enforcement mechanisms were brutal when corruption was discovered, but the incentives were strong. A supply sergeant who stole could get rich. The odds of being caught were lower than the odds of dying from disease. Rational calculation favored theft. The worst enemy wasn't the castle defenders. It was time. Sieges could last months or years. The siege of Ishiyama Hongenji in Japan lasted 10 years. 10 years of soldiers maintaining the same positions, watching the same walls, waiting for something to happen. The psychological impact of extended boredom, punctuated by brief terror, can't be overstated. Human minds require stimulation. Remove it, and cognition deteriorates. Add constant low-level stress, and the breakdown accelerates. Gambling became universal, despite being officially forbidden. Soldiers bet on anything. Dice games, card games, contests of strength, predictions about when the siege would end. Gambling provided the stimulation minds craved. It also created debts, conflicts, and violence. Men who lost everything would steal to continue playing or to pay debts. Fights erupted over accusations of cheating. Officers tried to suppress gambling, failed, then tried to regulate it. Neither approach worked. The need for stimulation overwhelmed discipline. Alcohol consumption reached levels that would horrify modern medical professionals. When available, soldiers drank heavily, not for celebration, but for oblivion. Drunkenness provided temporary escape from boredom, fear, and conditions. Commanders tried to control alcohol supply, knowing that drunk soldiers made poor guards and worse fighters. But total prohibition led to mutiny faster than disease. So ale and wine flowed. Soldiers stayed partially intoxicated, and watch duty was performed by men whose blood alcohol content would disqualify modern workers from any job. Fighting among soldiers became endemic. Boredom plus proximity plus stress equals violence. Men fought over food, over gambling debts, over perceived insults, over nothing at all. Fights that started as arguments escalated to blades. Officers broke up brawls constantly. Severe punishments were handed out. Men were flogged, demoted, executed for fighting. It didn't stop. The violence was pressure release. Without it, the army would have imploded even faster. So commanders tolerated a certain level of internal violence as preferable to whatever would replace it. Sexual outlets were complicated by the fact that most siege camps were overwhelmingly male spaces. Some armies brought prostitutes along, women who followed military camps providing services for payment. These women occupied an uncomfortable social position, necessary but despised, tolerated but vulnerable. When supplies ran low, their safety declined. Stories of violence against camp followers are extensive and grim. Other soldiers turned to each other. Same-sex relationships existed, though officially forbidden. The penalties for being caught varied, but were always severe. Religion provided structure for some. Prayers marked time. Chaplains offered confession and communion. Religious services created routine in otherwise formless days. For believers, this was genuine comfort. For others, it was performance, going through motions to maintain social standing. The distinction mattered less than the structure itself. Having scheduled activities, even religious ones, prevented total descent into formlessness. Commanders encouraged religious observance not from piety, but from recognition that it helped maintain order. Creative outlets were rare but vital for those who found them. Soldiers carved wood, told stories, sang songs, wrote letters home. These activities required materials and skill that most lacked. But for those with access, creative work provided psychological protection. The man who spent his off-watch hours carving figurines had something to focus on beyond fear and filth. He had purpose, however small. This mattered more than outsiders would believe. Purpose was sometimes the only thing preventing complete breakdown. The concept of time itself became distorted. Days blurred together. Soldiers couldn't remember how long they'd been at the siege. Weeks felt like months. Months felt like years. This temporal distortion created disorientation that compounded other stressors. When you can't remember how long you've endured, you can't estimate how much longer you'll need to endure. The siege becomes eternal, a permanent state of suffering with no visible end. That realization breaks some men completely. We're living through a civilization-wide siege mentality right now. The enemy isn't outside the walls. It's the constant demand for vigilance across every aspect of life. Security theater at airports demands we stay alert for threats that statistically won't come. Smart home systems notify us of every movement near our houses. Email brings work demands at all hours. Social media trains us to scan for threats to our reputation, our careers, our beliefs. We've created a society that requires the same sustained hypervigilance that destroyed medieval siege guards. The modern security worker watching camera feeds experiences the identical psychology to the medieval guards scanning darkness for threats. Most of their shift involves nothing happening. hours of watching screens where nothing changes. Then, occasionally, maybe, something that might be a threat appears. They have seconds to decide whether to trigger an alarm that will mobilize response teams and inconvenience everyone, or to dismiss it as nothing and hope they're right. Get it wrong either way, and they're blamed. The technology changed. The psychological torture didn't. On-call work creates the siege rotation problem at scale. Doctors, IT workers, emergency responders, they're required to maintain readiness during off hours. They can't fully relax because the call might come at any moment. This prevents genuine rest. The body stays partially activated, adrenaline slightly elevated, ready to respond. It's exhausting. Studies show on-call workers suffer sleep disruption even when they're not actually called. Just the possibility of being called is enough to prevent proper rest. Medieval guards knew this problem intimately. Shift work in hospitals, factories, and service industries replicates the rotation systems that siege armies used. The intention is identical: maintain continuous operations by rotating workers through time slots. But human circadian rhythms don't adapt well to this. Night shift workers suffer higher rates of disease, cognitive impairment, and psychological distress. They're being asked to maintain alertness when their biology screams for sleep. Medieval guards had the same problem. The modern worker has better food and marginally better medicine. The fundamental incompatibility between human biology and sustained vigilance remains unchanged. Air traffic controllers face modern versions of medieval guard discipline. Their attention lapses can kill hundreds. The pressure is enormous. Systems are designed with redundancy, specifically because humans are fallible under stress. But redundancy creates its own problems. When workers know backups exist, vigilance decreases slightly. Not consciously, but neurologically. The brain allocates attention based on consequence probability. When consequences are distributed across redundant systems, individual vigilance decreases. This is why air traffic control has mandatory rest periods and strict shift limits. They're acknowledging that sustained vigilance is impossible. Parents with baby monitors experience low-grade hypervigilance that never fully ends. Every sound from the monitor might signal distress. Most sounds are fine, but the possibility of danger prevents total relaxation. This goes on for years. Parents become attuned to the monitor's every signal, unable to sleep deeply even when the baby is fine. The technology that's supposed to provide peace of mind instead creates constant low-level stress. Medieval guards would recognize this immediately. Different threat, identical dynamic. The normalization of exhaustion in modern work culture mirrors siege camp acceptance of chronic fatigue. Knowledge workers boast about pulling all-nighters. Emergency responders work shifts that would be illegal in other industries. The culture celebrates grinding through exhaustion as dedication when it's actually just system failure. We've collectively decided that demanding sustained alertness from people who are chronically exhausted is acceptable. Medieval commanders made the same decision. People died. We pretend we're different. Surveillance capitalism requires population-level hypervigilance. We monitor our metrics, our analytics, our engagement numbers. We scan for threats to our brand, our reputation, our market position. Companies watch their competitors obsessively. All of this demands attention that could go elsewhere. The mental load is substantial. It never ends. There's always another metric to check, another threat to monitor, another opportunity to miss if vigilance lapses. We've created an economic system that demands everyone maintain siege guard alertness constantly. Sieges ended in limited ways. The defenders surrendered, usually after starvation or disease made continued resistance pointless. The besiegers captured the fortification through assault, paying with blood for every yard. The besiegers withdrew, admitting defeat, either military or logistical. Or everyone died, which happened more often than history likes to admit. For the soldiers who survived, the end of watch didn't bring immediate relief. The psychological damage persisted long after the siege ended. The successful siege ending brought its own horrors. When fortifications fell, especially after extended resistance, the unwritten rules permitted sack. The besieging army was turned loose on the captured population as reward for their suffering. Civilians who'd endured the same starvation and disease as the defenders now faced rape, murder, and plunder. The soldiers doing this had spent months in conditions that stripped away humanity. The violence they unleashed was partly revenge for their suffering, partly the psychological release of men who'd been held in check too long. Failed sieges left psychological wreckage. Soldiers who'd endured months of disease, starvation, and terror for nothing struggled with the meaninglessness. Their friends had died, they'd suffered, and it accomplished nothing. The fortress still stood. The enemy was undefeated. This created a particular bitterness that infected veterans. They became cynical about military glory, about noble causes, about anything requiring sacrifice. They'd learned that you could do everything right and still fail. That lesson changed men. The return home was complicated for siege survivors. They'd left as healthy men. They returned scarred, diseased, often missing limbs. Dysentery had aged them prematurely. Psychological trauma made them difficult to live with. Nightmares were universal. Former guards would jolt awake at sounds, reaching for weapons that weren't there, scanning for threats that didn't exist. Families didn't understand. The men couldn't explain. The gulf between what they'd experienced and what could be communicated created isolation that many never escaped. Some never left psychologically. They'd physically departed the siege camp, but mentally remained on watch, scanning darkness for threats. This hypervigilance persisted through the rest of their lives. They couldn't relax in civilian settings, couldn't sleep properly, couldn't maintain the alertness their work demanded, but also couldn't stop being alert. This made them unemployable, unreliable, and eventually destitute. Many ended as beggars, surviving on charity, unable to reintegrate into the civilian life they'd left. The lessons learned from siege watch duty shaped military organization for centuries. The understanding that sustained vigilance requires rotation, redundancy, and brutal discipline became foundational. Military academies taught these principles. Officers learned to recognize the signs of watch breakdown and respond before catastrophe occurred. The systems evolved, but the core recognition remained. Human attention has limits, and ignoring those limits costs lives. Modern militaries still grapple with these realities. Combat deployments create the same psychological pressures as siege duty. Sustained alertness in environments where any moment might bring death, extended over months, produces predictable trauma. The treatment has improved. We now recognize PTSD instead of calling it cowardice. Support systems exist that medieval soldiers couldn't imagine. But the fundamental problem remains unsolved. How do you maintain human vigilance at superhuman levels without destroying the humans involved? You've spent hours with me exploring the nightmare of sustained vigilance in siege warfare. The systems that sometimes worked and often failed, and the psychological costs that persist across centuries. If you found this investigation valuable, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to Candle History. Let me know in the comments what modern parallel struck you most powerfully. I read everything. Thank you for maintaining your attention through this long examination of what happens when attention becomes mandatory. We began with a sound, a pebble in the mud at 3 in the morning. That simple moment crystallizes something essential about how we organize ourselves, how we try to create safety in dangerous worlds, and how those attempts change us in ways we don't fully understand. The medieval guard scanning darkness for threats that probably won't come is the same as the modern worker scanning emails for crises that might emerge. Different technologies, identical psychology. What the siege lines reveal is humanity's fundamental ambivalence about vigilance. We need someone to watch. We need that someone to be perfectly alert, despite being chronically exhausted. We need them to make instant decisions with perfect accuracy, despite operating under conditions designed to prevent accurate judgment. And we punish them brutally when they fail at impossible tasks. This pattern repeats across every era, every culture, every attempt to create security through sustained human attention. The quiet rules that governed siege watch duty weren't about efficiency. They were about managing fear. Fear of enemy attack, fear of punishment for failure, fear of letting down comrades, fear that your suffering meant nothing. The systems channeled that fear into structure. Rotation schedules, password protocols, signal systems, these created an illusion of control in fundamentally uncontrollable situations. The illusion worked well enough to keep armies functional. It didn't work well enough to prevent the catastrophes that kept reshaping the systems. Modern security culture inherited this dynamic without acknowledging it. We build systems that demand perfect vigilance, while ignoring that perfect vigilance is biologically impossible. The TSA agent scanning bags for weapons that statistically won't be there experiences the same psychological reality as the medieval bard scanning darkness. We've added technology. We haven't added human capacity for sustained attention. So we get security theater, performance of vigilance without actual security. Because actual security would require recognizing that humans can't maintain real vigilance indefinitely. The costs are distributed unevenly, as they always are. The wealthy can afford to outsource their vigilance. They hire security guards to watch their property, personal assistants to monitor their schedules, lawyers to scan for legal threats. The poor must maintain their own vigilance while simultaneously working jobs that demand additional vigilance. The result is a population chronically exhausted from scanning for threats across multiple domains simultaneously. We call this modern life. Medieval siege guards would call it familiar. What bothers me most is the forgetting. We've forgotten that these systems emerged from desperate necessity, that they were stopgap solutions to immediate crises, that they were never intended to be permanent. The password challenges, the shift rotations, the punishment protocols, these weren't designed for efficiency. They were discovered through trial and error while people died. But we've abstracted them into management theory, divorced from the blood that bought the lessons. We optimize without understanding what we're optimizing toward. Maybe the real lesson is humility about what we're asking of each other. Every system that demands sustained vigilance is asking for something humans can't reliably provide. We can approximate it through rotation, redundancy, and fear. We can push ourselves further than biology comfortably allows, but we can't transcend our limitations through discipline alone. The medieval guard who fell asleep and got everyone killed wasn't weak, he was human. The modern worker who misses the critical email isn't lazy, they're exhausted from doing the impossible. The siege eventually ends. Whether through victory, defeat, or collapse doesn't change the fundamental pattern. People push themselves beyond sustainable limits. Systems begin to fail. Either you recognize the failure and adjust, or you die. Medieval armies that learned this survived. Those that didn't became cautionary tales. We're conducting the same experiment at civilizational scale, demanding sustained vigilance from populations that are already exhausted, wondering why systems are failing. The answer is staring us in the face every time a modern security system breaks down for exactly the same reasons that medieval watch systems collapsed. So, what do we do with this? Probably nothing dramatic. You'll still get the 3 a.m. email. I'll still check my phone more than I should. The systems are too big to change through individual action. But maybe there's value in seeing them clearly, in recognizing that when we demand constant vigilance from ourselves or others, we're repeating patterns that have consistently failed throughout history. That the exhaustion isn't personal weakness, it's biological reality encountering systemic demands that ignore biology. The guard, scanning the siege line, and the worker, scanning their inbox, are fundamentally the same. Both are human. Both are exhausted. Both know that any lapse might have consequences. Both know that perfect vigilance is impossible. Both keep trying anyway, because the alternative is admitting that the system they're part of makes demands that can't be met. And that admission would require redesigning everything, which is harder than just enduring one more shift. In the end, the most honest observation might be that we're all on watch duty now. The siege never ended. It just changed shape. The walls became screens. The darkness became information overload. The enemies became abstract threats that might materialize at any moment. But the fundamental dynamic persists. Someone has to watch. That someone is exhausted. That someone is you. And the price of not watching is too high to contemplate, even though the price of watching is destroying us slowly. Maybe future generations will look at our security systems and workplace culture with the same incomprehension that we look at medieval siege lines. How could they demand such sustained vigilance? How did they think that was sustainable? Didn't they recognize the signs of collapse? And they'll be right to judge, just as we're right to judge the medieval commanders who executed guards for falling asleep after 6 weeks of continuous terror. But judgment without understanding is incomplete. Those commanders were trying to solve an impossible problem with inadequate tools. So are we. Here's to everyone who's ever pulled watch, in any era, under any sky. Here's to the guard who stayed awake, the one who failed, and the one who survived both. Here's to the impossible demands we make of each other and ourselves. And here's to the fragile, failing systems we build to pretend we can transcend our limitations. May your next shift be quieter. May your alarms be false. May the thing you're watching for never come. But keep watching anyway. The siege continues. Someone has to stand the watch.